Hello, I'm Michael Parker, and welcome to Antidote. Today we're talking about American foreign policy and our interventionist history. Iran, Iraq, Syria, it's all going to be on the table. We're going to be joined via Skype by Stephen Kinzer. He is a noted author and journalist. He's a former New York Times foreign correspondent, a Boston Globe columnist, senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and he is also the author of 8 books, several of which we will probably be discussing today. Mr. Kinzer, welcome to Antidote.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. I've been looking over your work over the past week, reading some of your articles, and we're going to be referencing some of those during today's discussion. One of the first that I wanted to start off with, because politically, I'm an independent, but my primary desire is less war. You have this article dated March 18th, which said, "Vote Sanders, everyone else will send your kids to war." So I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, because I'm wondering why you think Bernie will be the guy, or could be the guy, that could withstand the typical corporate or otherwise interests that would encourage us to get into this form of entanglement.
Well, first of all, I think you put yourself in a minority when you say that you are interested, when you look at presidential candidates, in how they're going to approach the outside world. The reality is that most voters place foreign policy and things related to national security or international affairs in a secondary position when they decide who they're going to vote for. As to that particular column, I actually did not endorse Sanders in the column. The headline was a little bit misleading, but it being a provocateur myself a bit, so I didn't object to that. What I wanted to say in that column is that Sanders has done something in this campaign that's long overdue and quite remarkable in American politics. Remarkable in part for the mere fact that it is so unusual. And that is, he's broken with some of the traditional foreign policy orthodoxy. In American politics, in Washington, particularly in presidential campaigns, there's a certain sameness to candidates' approaches to foreign policy. There is something like a Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative consensus on the broad outlines of American foreign policy. And it is undergirded by think tanks, many university centers, the whole press apparatus. So we have a force that draws candidates in towards the center to support a set of assumptions. And those assumptions begin in part with the idea that the United States is the indispensable nation in the world, that everybody out in the world is something like a half-finished American that's just dying to be more like us, and they're waiting for us to come to their countries and help them be like us, to rescue them from the tyrannies that they're suffering under, and that American military power is a positive way for the United States to project its influence in the world. You have to accept these and a number of other assumptions in order to embrace the consensus on foreign policy. Sanders broke from that. In a number of ways, he suggested that he would be less interested in intervening in foreign conflicts. In our foreign policy today, that's the real question. That's the central question of American foreign policy: intervention. Where do we intervene? Under what circumstances? With what tools? How? For how long? The candidates in this race were remarkably willing to stray from that consensus. Bernie most of all, but some of the other candidates as well. It was interesting that the most intervention-oriented candidates, who were probably Rubio, Lindsey Graham, and Jeb Bush, fell very quickly. And with the exception of Hillary Clinton, the candidates who remained in the race were not traditionally interventionist. Even Donald Trump has thrown some necks out of whack in Washington with his foreign policy pronouncements. So the broader point of my column was to salute the idea that during this presidential campaign, at least there's been some effort to pull us out of this deadening foreign policy consensus that keeps dragging us into foreign intervention.
I understood that, and I only wanted you to explain it because I agree with you. And you mentioned my guy, Ron Paul, within the article, and you also mentioned that these ideas, this is America is a take action kind of place, and that's kind of our default mode, but sometimes we don't need to take action. Sometimes we don't need to be up in people's business. And the reason that I said that that's one of my primary political interests is something I'm going to return to in the last part of the interview, which is just about, I don't think we can take care of things at home until we extricate ourselves from these misadventures abroad. You have this book called Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. And within this book, you talk about 14 different times over the past 100 or so years that America has intervened in countries, and the patterns are the same. Can you talk about that?
First of all, that book, Overthrow, does go through 14 episodes of American intervention, but I wouldn't claim those are the only 14. Actually, There have been many more than those. In that book, I narrowed it down to a particular set. So these are episodes in which the United States was the decisive force in overthrowing a foreign government. So I traced 14 of these times. And I think you can draw some lessons from American intervention if you look at the patterns over a period of 100 years or so. And I think it's important to do that. You don't want to see these as a series of disconnected individual episodes. You really only understand them when you see them as one long continuum. So one of the things I notice is the role that American corporations play in these interventions versus the role of national security and domestic concerns in Washington about U.S. role in the world. So here's what fits for most of these interventions. In fact, the United States does not normally intervene in foreign countries to protect the interests of American corporations. However, it's the trouble that American corporations get into in the first place in foreign countries that drags the United States into these countries. That's what first makes America aware that there's a so-called problem. So when, for example, Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran nationalized the oil in that country, or when Guatemala passed a land reform act that bothered the United Fruit Company, that alarmed American corporations. And that began the process of intervention. But then something happens as the process of planning the intervention moves into government, into the White House or the CIA, the motive changes. Then the motive becomes national security. It's to protect the U.S. against enemies. We tell ourselves that if a foreign country is giving trouble to an American corporation, that country, that government must be an enemy or a rival of ours, and therefore we must attack it. So in our own minds, we're not attacking it in order to defend corporate interest. We're attacking it in order to defend U.S. security interests. But the only reason we decided that we had a security interest was because a corporation had a problem there. So that's one of the big themes that I see. And if I could pick out one other one that rings through a century of interventions and is a great lesson for today, it's this. People who planned these interventions are, like many Americans, captive of a short attention span. They go into a project, they go overthrow the government of a country, then they come home, Americans move on to something else, their interest shifts, we forget about the intervention, and we assume that the people in the target country will also forget about it. But in fact, that doesn't happen. The memory of these American interventions festers and burns in the hearts and souls and minds of people in foreign countries. It may take years or decades or even generations, but so often these interventions have unforeseen consequences. They set off waves of trouble for the United States, even worse than the trouble that we originally intervened to stop. So in many cases, the interventions wind up not only harming the target country, but undermining American security.
And as you said, this litany of unintended consequences lodges in the brains and the cultural landscape of those particular countries that we barged into. And guess what? They don't like us anymore. This also feeds into this idea that you bring up. You say that the media, let's take Syria, for example, and here again, I agree with you, but I want you to explain what you mean. You're talking about this idea that the media are and have been misleading us regarding Syria, and you say that part of that has to do with this movement of much of the news reporting coming from Washington, not from people that are in the field. Talk about that a little bit.
The Syria situation, in my mind, is really a shameful episode in the history of the American press,
Yes.
in addition to the tragedy that it is for the Syrians. And it's part of something bigger, as you just mentioned. The fact is, there are very few foreign correspondents left for major American news media. There are others who are working on their own, but they don't really penetrate into the Washington echo chamber. So much of the news that we get about the world, and particularly about crisis spots like Syria, actually is generated in Washington. It doesn't come from Syria. So you have reporters in Washington who check their sources every day to write their Syria story. And their sources are the State Department, the Pentagon, maybe an embassy, then there's the think tanks, and then maybe an ambassador, and then you've covered the landscape. So you've talked to everybody, you've covered all sides. Actually, you haven't talked to any sides. You've just talked to all the same people in the same little echo chamber. The United States and the Obama administration has an interest in projecting a certain narrative about what's happening in Syria. And it has to do with the evil dictator stomping down on the brave, moderate rebels who only want to create Switzerland there, with Thomas Jefferson waiting in the wings to replace the brutal torturer. So if you don't share that narrative, if you start questioning it and writing stories that produce another narrative, you are frozen out of Washington. You don't get invited to the think tank meetings. You don't get your phone calls returned. You don't get interviews. Now, if you were out covering a story, it wouldn't matter that people in offices wouldn't speak to you, because you'd be out there seeing the story on your own. But when it comes to Syria, that's not the case. The people writing about Syria, the people that are telling us what's happening in Syria, are largely based in Washington. So I warn readers always to look at the dateline when you're reading stories about the rest of the world. And if you are reading about a foreign crisis and what's really happening there, and the dateline is Washington, you should be suspicious.
That makes sense to me. And I would have to ask, I mean, you mentioned the economics of this, that sometimes there's cutbacks and, so we have to take some of these people out of the field. But I would be the cynic and say, doesn't this also play into the larger effort where we are trying to portray a particular story? So if we've got these people in Washington, instead of in the field displaying what's happening accurately, that's really the desired result we wanted in the first place.
Absolutely. I think it serves the interests of the policy to have fewer people on the ground reporting what's happening. And it's also feeding the tendency to focus the reporting on what happened today.
Yes.
So you'll see stories about Syria saying a hospital was blown up. It was awful. The pediatrician was killed. A baby died. And then they ripped the whole oxygen unit apart. But you don't really understand. So who's behind this? What's the larger story? So in this case, as so often in covering foreign conflicts, news is really the enemy of information. News is what's happening right now. But what's happening today in Syria right now is not the important story. What's more important, first of all, is what happened yesterday. How did we get here? What's the reason that this is happening? And secondly, what's going to happen tomorrow? What is the result of what we're seeing today? But when you're so focused on just reporting the events of the hour, which the news cycle in some cases demands, then I think you pull back from reporting the larger story. And that's what has left Americans in so much real ignorance about what's happening in Syria.
I understand. It's just the continuing turning carnival of the pornography of violence that we see instead of any larger conversation explaining how we got to this place and did we perhaps have part of this?
Actually, this is something that I think we do overlook, and I want to stress this point. So the Syria crisis broke out in 2011. In 2012, the Secretary General of the United Nations joined with the Arab League to name a mediator to come up with a peace plan for Syria. So this was 1 year after the problem started. That was in 2012. And the mediator they chose was Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General. So Kofi Annan put together a peace plan. And the peace plan had a number of items on it. The central item was to start with the main parties to the conflict would sit down at a table and lay out their demands or their wishes or their proposals. Well, the United States refused to accept this proposal. Our view was, if you remember at that time, Assad must go, and we will not speak with Assad, nor will we speak with anyone who does not, before entering the room with us, agree to say Assad must go. So that meant we couldn't talk with Assad, we couldn't talk with Russia, we couldn't talk with Hezbollah, we couldn't talk with Iran. Major parties to the conflict were not in the room, and so Kofi Annan did the logical thing, which is he quit. He decided, well, if you're not ready to talk, then there's no point in presenting a peace plan. There's no one to present it to. So imagine that. That was 2012. We had a chance to sit down at a table with all the warring parties under the supervision of Kofi Annan, empowered by the UN and the Arab League. But we didn't do it because we said, oh no, for political reasons, we are not going to negotiate with Assad. We don't want to build up Iran's role in the region, so we won't sit down at a table with Iran. So to make these political points, we allowed this war to go on for another 4 years with all the carnage that you've seen. That kind of story gets lost in the daily rundown of what got blown up today.
And the untold violence that has come after it, the hundreds of thousands of people that have been displaced, all because we didn't want to talk to Iran and Russia and a few others.
It's really not a unique episode in American diplomatic history in the Middle East. I can remember back in the late 1990s showing up in Iraq when Iraq was under Saddam Hussein and suffering under severe international sanctions led by the United States. I had a United Nations official hold up a lead pencil to me and tell me that he could not import lead pencils for school children in Iraq because the American Sanctions Authority told him that the lead in the pencil could be dual use, that is, it could be military use, because it could be removed from the pencil, ground down, rubbed onto the nose of an airplane, and then render that airplane invisible to radar. Therefore, no pencils for the Iraq school children. And while I was there, I also witnessed this tragedy of the babies and children dying in the hospital by literally the thousands because they didn't have medication. And later on, you may recall that the Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, was asked about a UN report saying that 500,000 children and infants had died in Iraq as a result of U.S. sanctions. And she was asked whether it was worth it. And she didn't even bother to question the number. And she just said, yes, it was worth it. So we have this willingness to accept human suffering in order to make a political point that calls some of our humanitarian instincts into question.
Absolutely. And I would address that by just saying, after World War II, after the Cold War, yes, the reigning superpower, the United States of America, the Superman of the globe, the good guys, the police. Well, you know what? After a few decades of these types of misadventures, to me, we have lost the moral high ground. And to try to pretend that we haven't seems naive and unfair, or not unfair, but just naive and untrue.
Well, I think two things have happened in that period since the end of the World War II, as we look back on it. First of all is the one to which you referred, and that is that we come to realize as we look around the world that there are countries that see us as a bully
Yes.
and an aggressor. It's difficult for us. I really think that there are many bullies in the world, but most of the countries that are bullies have a recognition that that's how they behave. I don't think the Russians, for example, would contest the argument, or the French, that they push people around when they have to. But Americans, perhaps only the Chinese and Americans are the bullies that are shocked when anyone thinks when anyone tells us that we are a bully. So I think slowly we've come to realize that maybe we don't always have the humanitarian and moral high ground. But I think there's another factor to bear in mind, and that is that the institutions that were placed into office in the period after World War II, like the World Bank and the United Nations and the
Yes.
International Monetary Fund, NATO, were all built to deal with a particular world situation. And that also, you could argue, included CIA interventions and everything we did during that period. So, put aside the argument that those interventions and much of what America did may have cost us some of our moral credibility and undermined our own security. But in addition to that, we are now past that era. So those institutions and that approach to the world was built for another age. We now have a set of policies that may or may not have been wise to fit a situation that existed in the past, but that situation doesn't exist anymore. So our foreign policies are shaped to meet American needs in a world that no longer exists. Our foreign policies are so slow to change, and this is dangerous over the long run for a country. If you look at the nations in history that have survived over long periods, like Iran or China, those are countries that have learned to ride the currents of history. They can adapt to history. The United States has not yet learned to do this. The arc of our history is quite short, and it's misleading, because up until very recently, it has told us that everything gets better. We always get richer, we get stronger, we get more prosperous. And now that we're entering into a period when we're starting to realize that may not be true, and indeed it has never been true for any country or empire in the history of the world, we're going to have to make a big psychological adjustment. And that's something that I'm not sure Americans are prepared for. All the way back to Thucydides, it has been observed that conflict emerges when a rising power challenges a dominant power. And the conflict normally does not come from the challenger. It normally comes started by the country that's already on top, that starts a conflict for fear of losing its dominant position. That goes all the way back to the Peloponnesian Wars, and it's been proven all the way up to the 20th century. So it augurs for turbulence in the world if the United States is not going to be able to accept its changing role in a world that is being shaped by forces that we do not control.
Mr. Kinzer, I think that a portion of the populace is ready for that. They get what you're saying, and I think it's emblematic when we see the rise of a person like Bernie. However, on the other hand, the establishment doesn't want to change, and I will take this all the way back to your book, The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers and Iran, and I would, if I'm understanding you correctly, really I would say that what those guys did at that time set us up for this path of interventionism ever after.
It's certainly true that the extraordinary work of the Dulles brothers during the 1950s still resonates through America and the world, and not in a good way. So, John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower in the 1950s, and his younger brother, Allen Dulles, was director of the CIA. That was the first time in history that siblings, brothers, controlled the overt and the covert sides of American foreign policy. It meant that since they had grown up so intimately together and were very much a product of the Wall Street corporate law firm where they both spent decades representing international corporations, they thought very similarly. There never had to be a meeting between State Department experts and CIA experts to discuss whether to overthrow the government of country X. Just a wink and a nod between the two brothers, and an operation would be carried out. So the Dulles brothers were great exemplars of the idea that we could intervene in countries around the world, achieve our goals, and then the memory of the intervention would fade away and there would never be any long-term consequences. The Dulles brothers also were emblematic in another way of America's approach to the world, and that is they had no understanding for the nationalism of people in other countries. They epitomized an idea that goes back to Theodore Roosevelt and before, that the United States is a wonderful entity that we feel closely tied to, and we want to fight for it, and we want to defend it, and we love it, and we kiss its flag, and we feel fervently connected to this country that we love. But we can't imagine that other people would feel the same way about their own countries. And this inability to understand the power of nationalism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America was also a driving force behind the interventions of the Dulles brothers in the 1950s, and it has continued to afflict our foreign policy. We don't really recognize that when you shoot at somebody and across your border, that they're likely to shoot back. We are separated by these giant oceans from the rest of the world, so we haven't had to learn the skill of getting along with other countries and respecting the interests of other countries. But we're now seeing in a globalized world that the victims of some of our interventions can come back and bite us in many terrifying ways. And I hope that is going to raise our awareness of the negative implications of an interventionist foreign policy.
I agree with you, sir. And I would even say, I mean, a couple of months ago, even Donald Trump, when he was talking about Syria, is like, hey, yeah, man, let Putin go in there, do what he's got to do. I think that the people who are in touch with regular Americans realize, listen, we can't afford this anymore. It's not our business. We need to take care of our country first. But I must ask you, do you think that we can take care of America first if we're still involved in all of these foreign entanglements?
First of all, I have to say in a bizarre way, I salute Trump for not reading directly off the Washington playbook. I don't think anybody has given him the script that Washington has for presidential candidates. So he's said things that are completely taboo in the Washington Beltway. He questions whether we should continue supporting NATO, whether we should continue to guarantee that we will defend South Korea and Japan forever under any circumstances, whether it's really a good idea to keep sticking our finger into Putin's eye. So good for him. Unfortunately, he's too imperfect a vessel, and his anti-interventionism is not reliable, and it's not undergirded by any kind of a rational doctrine. So I don't take it as very encouraging. Nonetheless, I do think that it reflects a common sense that it seems to be at odds with much of our foreign policy. It should be obvious to a person who is not a lifelong Washington foreign policy expert, for example, that in Syria, our number one goal should be to defeat ISIS. And what we should be doing to everybody who's fighting there is to say, if you want to help defeat ISIS, you're on our side. If not, we're against you. This is the only thing we want to do. We are not getting involved in overthrowing regimes or doing anything else. So Why are we trying to shape the Middle East still and shape so much of the rest of the world when we have had such a failure in shaping our own country? And I do think there's a connection. I think people in much of the world look at the United States now and see our crumbling infrastructure, our corrupt political system, the crazy presidential campaign, and wonder what sort of an example we expect to set for the rest of the world.
People say those things all the time, and you are exactly right. And I would take it even another step further. When we bust into these various countries like a bull in the china shop and we're going to set things right or what have you, it's like, listen, we were not invited there. And by being there and occupying and running amok, it does not allow the people whose country it truly is to settle those problems that existed. It's not up to us to fix those things, and they don't want us to fix them anyway.
And I would even go a step further. You create a situation of moral hazard. That is, you give the factions inside the country no incentive to negotiate with each other.
Yes.
This is another thing we did with Syria. So as soon as there were demonstrations against Assad in 2011, the Americans jumped up and said, Assad must go. Okay, we don't want him. He's finished. Now, as a result of this, the opposition groups, many of which were simply asking for certain reforms, not the overthrow of the entire governing system, thought to themselves, well, there's no reason for us to negotiate any kind of a peaceful solution. The most powerful country in the world has just announced they want Assad gone altogether. So let's just fight against him. We took away the incentive for them to negotiate. That's the same thing we've done in Eastern Europe with the small countries that are right on Russia's border. They have no incentive to try to reach some accommodation with Russia because we are right behind them. But ultimately, the time has to come when they've got to stand up on their own feet. You could easily argue that Western Europe needed the support of the United States during the Soviet era. But the Soviet era is long gone. And now Europe needs its own security alliance, if it thinks it needs one, that it designs and it supports and it finances. Nonetheless, these institutions that we build are based so strongly on the idea that the United States has to be there. We can't imagine that the world could function or that any country could resolve its own internal problems without our help. But actually, the opposite is true. As long as we are there, there's no incentive for local groups to resolve their own problems. And that, I think, is at the core of much of the upheaval that you're still seeing throughout the greater Middle East.
Exactly. Let me ask you in our last final moments, you were brought to my attention by my co-producer, Shazi Usman, and I started reading your work, and I was struck by just how much common sense it made to me. So I ask you, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic that change will be coming and that some of the ideas that you are talking about will make their way into the political mainstream?
I go to Washington as rarely as possible, but whenever I do, I am struck by how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy. You really do have to accept a whole series of premises and assumptions about American exceptionalism and the indispensability of America around the world in order to participate in discussion about shaping foreign policy. Otherwise, you're stigmatized as, in the wonderful phrase of John McCain, a wacko bird.
Yes.
So us wacko birds don't have much of a platform. It's truly remarkable to me that, first of all, on the op-ed pages of all three major American newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, there's no regular voice from this perspective. You don't have a single columnist questioning the interventionist perspective. In addition, I wonder, what about in the U.S. Senate? There's nobody, or in the U.S. Congress. You're not hearing any kind of a coherent effort to present an alternative foreign policy. So some of us are still out here rattling on banging our spoon on the high chair, but I have to say that the presidential campaign has been a crack in the wall. It's interesting, as I said earlier, that some of the most interventionist candidates fell by the wayside, and that the candidates that remained in the race the longest, with the sole exception of Hillary Clinton, were people who, in one way or another, questioned the interventionist paradigm. Now, you might argue that all of that is irrelevant, because the person who's the one exception, Hillary Clinton, who is the likely winner of the presidential election as it looks from now, is a very traditional interventionist. Mm-hmm. So maybe the fact that all these other candidates broke from the consensus doesn't mean anything in the long run. Nonetheless, the candidates like Bernie Sanders, who did break from the foreign policy consensus on a variety of issues, were not punished by the voters. When you said, for example, that America should be neutral between Israel and Palestine, as Donald Trump did, or when Bernie Sanders expressed support for the suffering of, or understanding for the suffering of Palestinian people. Voters did not react against that in a negative way. So I'm hoping that maybe this presidential campaign has opened the door a little bit to some wider discussion of these issues. Nonetheless, a fundamental re-examination of America's role in the world is not something we're going to see imminently. It's something that I think may be forced upon us by events. And let's see where they take us in the next few years.
Mr. Kinzer, thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed your work as I've been reading over it the last couple of weeks. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you'll come back again.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Michael Parker. This has been Antidote, and these are important questions that we are asking. Our foreign policy is too often interventionist, and maybe we need to take care of issues at home. Am I wrong? Am I right? What are your thoughts on this? Feel free to leave your comments below. Keep them classy. My name is Michael Parker. As always, I implore you to remain optimistic, stay vigilant. Until next week, you, me, every single one of us, we're the Antidote.